Created by Rob Liefeld and Fabian Nicieza, Deadpool first appeared in the pages of New Mutants issue 98 in 1990. And boy was he a controversial figure. Fans immediately noted how similar Deadpool was to the prominent Teen Titans villain Deathstroke. I mean, they were both mercenaries that wore full body suits, used guns and swords, and their names are so similar, it is an absolute joke. The character of Deadpool is definitely inspired by Deathstroke, and that has caused, as you would guess, a lot of controversy and debate among fans. But personally, I question the legitimacy of Rob Liefeld and Fabian Nicieza's creation of Deadpool from a different lens. They are often credited for Deadpool's creation, but the Deadpool they created is extremely different from the Deadpool we know now. In the character's first appearance, Deadpool was a funny guy, but he lacked a lot of the elements we usually associate with a character today. He didn't break the fourth wall like Chimichangas or use the raunchy, insensitive, and random humor that makes him so simultaneously beloved and divisive. The truth is, Deadpool isn't just the creation of two people. He's also the product of every creative team that came after. Creators like Joe Kelly, Gail Simone, Daniel Way, Cullen Bunn, all of them are also responsible for who Deadpool is today. This is not just the case for Deadpool though. All superheroes are a joint effort, the result of multiple creative teams handling a character over a long period of time. Whenever a new writer and artist come along, they have the power to improve and add upon what was established before. So many popular characters today, like Black Panther, She-Hulk, and even Superman, had pretty mid first appearances. It's often later creative teams that change and redefine characters to give them the great stories they're now known for today. Even though Carmine Infantino and Dave Wood were responsible for the creation of Animal Man, it was writer Grant Morrison and artist Chas Trugg who really made the character special in their pro-vegan and metatextual take on the character in 1988. Stan Lee and John Buscema may have created She-Hulk, but it's really John Byrne that introduced Jennifer Walters' party girl persona, which she is most known for today. Kite Man was a D-list supervillain created in the 1960s by Bill Finger and Dick Sprang, but had a sudden resurgence in popularity in the past few years because of the heartbreaking origin story writer Tom King and artist Clay Mann gave him in the pages of the Batman storyline, The War of Jokes and Riddles. I am not here to tear down the original creators of comic book characters. They laid the groundwork for the characters we now know and love, and they deserve to get royalties and all the financial perks for creating such massive cultural icons. I'm just here to illustrate the fact that creative teams that come after the original ones matter just as much when it comes to the success of a character. What's so special and unique about superhero comics is that they continue basically forever. Characters get passed on from one team to the next, creating this constant cycle of change, renewal, and innovation that I find really interesting. The story of the comic book superhero is one that never ends, but as much as that propels creativity, it's actually the cause of superhero comics' biggest problems. So, let's talk about that. The first problem that arises because of the never-ending nature of superhero comics is a barrier to entry. For new readers, it's really intimidating to get into superhero comics because there's just so much that has been published over the years. Batman has had over 80 years of comic history, and it could be confusing for new readers to know where to start. There are so many types of Batman stories told over the years, and if you just read a random Batman comic, there's a chance that what's happening is totally unfamiliar to you. This problem isn't very big anymore though. With the internet, we have thorough and comprehensive comic recommendation lists. We also have YouTube videos and Wikipedia pages that explain history in a digestible and even entertaining manner. Right now, it's actually easier than ever to start reading superhero comics because of all the resources we have at our disposal. But this barrier to entry due to superhero comics' dense history is still intimidating to a lot of people. When reading manga, watching movies, and playing video games is so much more accessible and easy to dive into, it's no wonder why people would choose them over comics. I happen to be here for some reason, and you can't insult me because you're here watching this niche and nerdy video. And for that, I thank you. Anyway, going back to the problem, I don't think it's too huge, but the next one is pretty big. I mean, it's not as small. So, because superhero comics never end, there are times where a new creative team comes along and screws everything up. One pretty recent example of this is what happened with Dick Grayson in 2018. In Batman issue 55 by Tom King and Tony Daniel, Dick Grayson is shot in the head by KG Beast. And in Dick Grayson's Nightwing series, he wakes up with no memory of who he is. And for the next 2 years in real life, instead of being Nightwing like he usually is, Dick Grayson assumes the role of Rick Grayson. You heard me right. Dick Grayson, the friendly and optimistic acrobat, becomes Rick Grayson, an edgelord with a temper like no other. And since Nightwing doesn't exist in the DC universe anymore, 4 cops team up and basically become the next Nightwings. I personally found it readable, but not very good. A lot of fans, on the other hand, absolutely hated this change. And let me tell you, this phase lasted for 2 years. Nightwing fans had to wait 2 years for Dick Grayson to return. Sometimes bad phases last for longer than 2 years though. Occasionally, a creative team will make a change so universally hated by fans, and that change will not be reverted. In June of 1987, The Amazing Spider-Man Annual Issue 21 was released, the iconic issue where Peter Parker and Mary Jane get married. They would stay married for the next 2 decades, until the infamous Spider-Man storyline titled One More Day. I will not mention the people who are behind this story because they are unfortunately being continually harassed and sent death threats to this day for a comic that they took part in making. And if that doesn't show you how much hate this Spider-Man story arc has, I don't know what will. The whole story takes place after Aunt May is shot by a bullet intended for Peter Parker. In this 4-issue story arc, Peter desperately tries to find a way to save Aunt May. He gets financial help from Iron Man and seeks assistance from Doctor Strange, but it isn't enough. Finally, Peter and Mary Jane are given an opportunity by Mephisto. Trade their marriage and love to save Aunt May's life. Wipe Peter and Mary Jane's relationship from existence to restore the life of Peter's mother figure. And well, they take that decision. I cannot describe how heartbreaking this story is. It's all doom and gloom with no light at the end of the tunnel whatsoever. Even though the dialogue was well written and the art is solid, I cannot express how bad this ended up being for Peter Parker's progression as a character. Peter Parker and Mary Jane's relationship, one of comic books' most iconic and progressive and wholesome couples, was torn apart, and still is to this day. It's really weird how Peter and Mary Jane's relationship has been dealt with throughout the past 2 decades, and most fans are just tired of it. Spider-Man One More Day is the most notorious example of bad changes in comics that have negative, lasting effects, and it really sucks when this stuff happens. But the thing with bad changes in comics, though, is that they are subjective. What I think is good for Iron Man might not be what you think is good for him, and that's totally fine. And when fans get pretty divided and confused about a change, it's always interesting to me. An example of this is the aging up of Jonathan Kent, Superman's son from a child to a late teenager. He was a character people really loved, and many were rightfully angry when Brian Michael Bendis suddenly made him older. But now, with his current series getting some critical acclaim, fans are kind of divided on whether or not to bring John back to childhood. This example really shows how subjective a change can be. There is an objective problem, though, that often arises because superhero comics never end, and that is continuity errors, inconsistencies, and a lot of confusion. For example, who is faster, Flash or Superman? Well, in the comic Flash Rebirth by Jeff Johns and freaking Ethan Van Sciver, it is shown that Barry Allen is much faster than Superman, which makes sense. His whole thing is running. It would be odd for Superman to be faster than Flash. But in Tom King and Andy Kubert's Superman Up in the Sky, Clark Kent beats Barry Allen in a race. So, what's the answer to that question? I still think the Flash is faster, but it's pretty weird and confusing. When new writers come along and add their own spin to things, they can often neglect previous stories for the sake of their own. Sometimes that's a good thing, but it's nonetheless confusing. Speaking of confusing, let's talk about Hawkman, who has had a really confusing backstory that has changed multiple times over the years. I was actually going to try and explain it in the beginning, but after looking into it more, I'd rather point you to videos on the internet. To prove just how confusing it is, though, I will tell you a story. In 1997, Grant Morrison became the head writer of Justice League of America, and when they wanted to put Hawkman in the book, DC didn't allow them to. Grant Morrison, one of the most prolific and iconic comic book writers of all time, was not allowed to write Hawkman because his backstory was that muddled and convoluted. It's insane. Superhero comic books never end. And these 3 problems, a tough barrier to entry for new readers, character-destroying series by creative teams you don't like, and confusing backstories that will continue to even be more complicated as time goes on, these are all unpreventable effects of the never-ending nature of superhero comics. As long as superhero comics continue to go on, these problems will always exist. And yet, superhero comics are still around despite the existence of these problems. The truth of the matter is that superhero comics never being able to end, the thing that is causing the problems we've talked about this whole video, is also what makes superhero comics so special in the first place. The universe being able to go on forever allows these characters to adapt over time and continue to be relevant despite being created so long ago. And what's also cool about superhero comics never ending is that you can go back to old comics and see what America was like back then. The values, political atmosphere, and culture that shaped the country at the time. in the 60s, the space race between the US and the Soviet Union was happening, and so a lot of Marvel and DC comics were sci-fi and space-themed. In the 90s, comic books became collectibles and tried to be mainstream, tried to be seen as cool and edgy. And you can see it. Men were drawn incredibly muscular and often wore slick, shiny costumes. Women, on the other hand, were depicted in extremely promiscuous fashion, with big breasts and extremely unrealistic waist sizes. Through superhero comics, you can also see which celebrities are popular. When the 2008 US election was on its way, Barack Obama was in a Spider-Man comic. And in the comic series Totally Awesome Hulk, Jeremy Lin somehow makes an appearance. The main reason I like superhero comics never ending, though, is not because of how they reflect and shape culture or how they affect the real world. I just think that it makes for some really good stories. I love when obscure, unimportant characters suddenly re-emerge and become popular again because of a creative team's shenanigans. I love when characters are taken in completely new directions that somehow work against all odds. I can't help but be awestruck when a character is consistently well written for years. And this year, I think I've found one of the best examples of long-form superhero storytelling. Written by Stan Lee with art by Jack Kirby, Daredevil issue 1 gets published to newsstands in April of 1964. Unbeknownst to them, the character would become one of Marvel's most iconic heroes, because around 15 years later, an artist named Frank Miller takes over the book in place of Roger Mackenzie. He takes charge of both the art and the story, and in the span of a few years, creates some of the best stories ever told in the comic book art form, and in turn, cements Daredevil as one of Marvel's greatest heroes. He quits for a while, and then returns for his final story arc for the character, titled Born Again. This is crowned as one of comic book's best stories, a storyline that shows the capability of comic books to be literary masterpieces. And what's interesting is that after Frank Miller's departure from the series, the general consensus among fans and critics is that Daredevil doesn't lose its quality. Now, I can't definitively say this since I haven't read every Daredevil comic since then, but from what I've read, this is true. The first half of this year saw me reading Daredevil from 2003, the series by Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev, until the present series written by Chip Zdarsky and drawn by Marco Checchetto. This was one of the best experiences I've ever had as a reader. It's kind of insane just how good most of what I read was. The odds of getting mostly great writers and artists back to back to back for decades on end is infinitesimal, and somehow Daredevil has had absolutely amazing creative teams handle the character for a really long time. Since Frank Miller, so many writers and artists have taken that challenge to one-up him and have done so shockingly successfully. There are so many ways the character of Matt Murdock has been spun and developed over the years, and they're all equally valid and interesting. It's kind of a miracle, honestly. Daredevil is the best case example of what the never-ending nature of superhero comics can accomplish. It can create a long-form story like no other, one built upon a diverse set of minds and ideas, resulting in a multifaceted and complex character that can't exist in many other forms of media. So, to answer the question that is in the title of this video, Is it a problem that superhero comics never end? Well, it creates a few problems, but because of the leeway and freedom that it offers, superhero comics have great and unique storytelling potential. Sure, they can be confusing, disappointing, and intimidating, but from these never-ending universes bloom what I believe to be some of the best stories ever told. My name is Joshua C, and I'll see you in the next one.